The message that drew attention on Africa News was not born from gunfire or political platforms. It emerged from a rare moment of moral awakening. Ibrahim Traoré, representing Burkina Faso's new generation of leadership, did not speak about power or security. He chose to speak about faith, a subject both fragile and profound, and one that has often been distorted by history. Behind every moral message lies a human face. In this story, that face is represented by ERIKA. She is not introduced as a public figure, a statistic, or a political symbol. She is presented simply as a woman of Christian faith carrying a profound, private loss. ERIKA's presence shifts the narrative away from speeches and into lived experience. Her faith did not shield her from pain. It did not prevent grief. What it offered instead was something far less dramatic and far more difficult to measure: the strength to remain standing when collapse felt justified. This distinction matters, especially in a world where faith is often marketed as a guarantee of protection or reward. Ibrahim Traoré's words intersect with ERIKA's story at precisely this point. He does not speak to her as a leader, offering consolation from above. He speaks as someone who understands that suffering does not invalidate belief. In Burkina Faso, this understanding carries particular weight. Loss is not theoretical. It is part of daily life for families affected by violence, displacement, and economic instability. Africa News may report the numbers, but the emotional cost is borne quietly, often by women like ERIKA. Traoré's message does not attempt to explain suffering away. He does not suggest that pain has a hidden blessing or that justice will arrive on a predictable timeline. Instead, he affirms something more restrained and more honest. Faith, he suggests, is not a cure for loss. It is a refusal to let loss define the end of the story. This perspective resonates deeply within Burkina Faso's social fabric. Women, particularly women of faith, have long carried the invisible labor of emotional survival. They bury the dead, raise children amid uncertainty, and preserve moral continuity when institutions fail. ERIKA's story is not exceptional, it is representative. In this context, Ibrahim Traoré's tone becomes crucial. He avoids heroic language. There is no promise that courage will be rewarded quickly or visibly. What he offers instead is recognition. He acknowledges that endurance itself is an act of resistance. In a world where violence seeks to reduce people to fear, remaining human is already a form of defiance. For American viewers over 40, this framing may feel unfamiliar, yet deeply relatable. Many have experienced moments when institutions disappointed them, when faith communities fractured, or when personal loss stripped away certainty. ERIKA's story echoes those experiences, even though it unfolds in Burkina Faso. Geography changes, but grief does not. Africa News often portrays African suffering as distant and overwhelming. By focusing on a single human narrative, this message disrupts that distance. It insists that loss is not an abstraction. It is carried in silence, in prayer, and in the daily choice not to surrender to bitterness. The emotional center of this section rests on one quiet truth: hope does not arrive from power. It arrives from those who refuse to let darkness claim the final word. Ibrahim Traoré does not present himself as the source of that hope. He simply points to it, already alive, already breathing, in people like ERIKA. And yet, personal endurance alone is not enough. When faith remains silent in the face of systemic abuse, suffering multiplies. This realization pushes the story toward its next, more confrontational phase, where belief is no longer only personal, but moral and public. There comes a moment in every society when silence becomes a form of consent. This is the moment Ibrahim Traoré addresses most directly, and it is the moment where his message moves from consolation to confrontation. Throughout history, religion has carried two very different faces. One is humble, rooted in compassion, sacrifice, and protection of the weak. The other is rigid, weaponized, and aligned with power. In Burkina Faso, as in many parts of the world, people have learned to recognize the difference not through theory, but through pain. Africa News has documented conflicts where religious language was used to justify violence, mask corruption, or demand obedience from those already suffering. Traoré does not approach this subject cautiously. He names the danger without attacking belief itself. He argues that faith becomes most dangerous when it is stripped of moral accountability and handed to those who seek control. In such moments, religion no longer points people toward truth. it shields lies. This distinction is central to understanding his position. Ibrahim Traoré does not call on people to abandon Christianity. He calls on Christians to remember it. He reminds them that the teachings attributed to Jesus Christ did not serve empires. They challenged them. They did not protect the powerful. They exposed them. In Burkina Faso, this message resonates because communities have seen how easily sacred language can be turned into political armor. Leaders invoke God while ignoring suffering. Institutions quote scripture while excusing injustice. Over time, people grow confused. Some abandon faith entirely. Others cling to it defensively, afraid to question authority. Traoré rejects both paths. Instead, he issues a quieter but far more demanding call. He asks believers to stand up, not against other faiths, but against falsehood spoken in God's name. This is not a call to violence. It is a call to moral courage. According to Traoré's framing, faith does not need protection through force. It needs protection through truth. For audiences following African news, this approach challenges common narratives. African leaders are often portrayed as either secular strongmen or religious populists. Traoré fits neither category. He presents himself as a moral witness, insisting that religious belief must answer to conscience before it answers to authority. This is where the message begins to echo beyond Burkina Faso. In the United States, religion has also been pulled into political battles, used to divide communities and justify policies that many believers themselves struggle to reconcile with their moral values. For Americans over 40, this tension is not theoretical. It is something they have watched unfold over decades. Traoré's message does not accuse the West. It holds up a mirror. It suggests that when faith is reduced to an identity badge or political weapon, it loses its soul, and when that happens, societies fracture quietly from the inside. The power of this section lies in its refusal to offer easy villains. There is no single enemy named. The responsibility is collective. Believers are asked to examine their silence. Leaders are asked to examine their motives. Communities are asked to remember what faith was meant to protect in the first place. This moment marks a turning point in the narrative. The story is no longer only about endurance in suffering. It is about accountability. Faith, Traoré insists, must speak when injustice hides behind sacred words. And once that line is crossed, the consequences ripple outward, shaping not only personal belief, but the political and social future of Burkina Faso and beyond. When a message born in Burkina Faso begins to resonate far beyond Africa, it forces a difficult question. Why are so many people, particularly older audiences in the United States, paying attention to words spoken from a place they have long been taught to overlook? The answer lies not in geography, but in shared experience. For decades, African news has framed African leadership primarily through crisis, coups, insurgencies, humanitarian emergencies. Rarely does the narrative slow down to examine moral leadership or spiritual accountability. Ibrahim Traoré's message disrupts that pattern. It speaks to a hunger that exists not only in Burkina Faso, but across societies that have watched institutions lose credibility. In the United States, many citizens over 40 have lived through cycles of political promises, cultural division, and religious polarization. They have seen faith used to mobilize voters, justify wars, and excuse inequality. Over time, trust eroded, churches fractured, communities retreated into suspicion. Traoré's message feels familiar because it names a wound Americans recognize, even if they rarely hear it articulated from outside the Western world. What makes this moment striking is the reversal of roles. Traditionally, moral instruction has flowed from the West toward Africa. Now, a leader from Burkina Faso speaks with clarity about faith, truth, and responsibility. And American audiences find themselves listening, not because he offers solutions, but because he refuses to lie. Ibrahim Traoré does not claim moral superiority. He does not position Africa as an innocent victim or the West as a villain. Instead, he frames faith as a universal test. When belief aligns with power instead of conscience, societies decay. When belief demands truth instead of loyalty, renewal becomes possible. This framework transcends borders. For viewers who follow African news closely, this reframing is significant. It suggests that Africa is not merely reacting to global forces, but actively contributing to the moral conversation shaping the future. Burkina Faso, often reduced to headlines about instability, becomes a source of reflection rather than pity. In American cultural memory, leadership is often associated with confidence, dominance, and control. Traoré offers something different. He offers restraint. He acknowledges limits. He speaks without spectacle. For older Americans who have grown weary of performative politics, this tone carries unexpected weight. The message also raises uncomfortable questions. If a leader in Burkina Faso can openly challenge the misuse of religion, why is such clarity so rare elsewhere? If faith can be spoken of without demanding obedience, why do so many institutions insist on silence? These questions linger long after the speech ends. Globally, the implications are just as significant. As societies grapple with identity, belief, and power, voices like Ibrahim Traoré's remind us that moral authority does not come from history, wealth, or military strength. It comes from the willingness to tell the truth when it costs something. This is where the story prepares for its final turn, because messages like this do not remain abstract. They reshape how leaders are perceived, how nations define themselves, and how people imagine the future. In Burkina Faso, that shift carries particular weight, and what happens next may change how the world understands leadership coming out of Africa. Up to this point, Ibrahim Traoré has been framed as a moral voice, a witness to pain, and a critic of religious abuse. But here, the story takes a decisive turn. The message is no longer only about faith or endurance. It becomes about power itself and how power is redefined. In traditional political narratives, authority flows from institutions, weapons, or foreign backing. Burkina Faso has lived under that model for decades. External interests dictated priorities. Internal elites guarded privilege. Ordinary people were expected to adapt, endure, and remain silent. Africa News has chronicled this pattern repeatedly across the continent. Traoré's approach quietly disrupts that equation. By grounding leadership in moral legitimacy rather than fear, he shifts the center of gravity. Power, in his framing, does not begin with command. It begins with credibility. When people recognize their own values reflected back at them, obedience is no longer forced. It becomes voluntary. This is the moment where Ibrahim Traoré transitions from being seen as a transitional figure to a symbol. Not a flawless hero, but a representation of a deeper change underway in Burkina Faso. His refusal to exploit religion for political gain signals something rare. It suggests that leadership can exist without manipulating belief. For many citizens, this shift carries emotional weight. After years of betrayal, trust does not return easily. But moral consistency opens a door that violence never could. Traoré does not promise that reform will be painless or fast. Instead, he reframes success. Success is not domination, it is dignity restored. In Africa News discourse, coups are often discussed as disruptions. What is less examined is what follows psychologically. When leadership acknowledges spiritual and ethical wounds, it changes how people interpret authority. They begin to see themselves not as subjects, but as participants in a shared moral project. This is where the twist deepens. Traoré's message elevates him beyond a national figure. Internationally, he becomes a reference point, not because he claims greatness, but because he refuses to perform it. In a world saturated with spectacle, restraint itself becomes power. For American audiences over 40, this moment resonates sharply. Many have watched leaders accumulate influence while moral clarity faded. They have seen institutions demand loyalty without offering truth. Traoré's stance suggests another path, one where leadership is measured by the courage to confront uncomfortable realities rather than avoid them. In Burkina Faso, this redefinition of power has tangible consequences. Communities begin to speak more openly. Faith leaders feel pressure to align their words with their actions. Political discourse shifts, slowly, from fear toward accountability. These changes are subtle, but they matter. This is not romanticism, it is risk. A leader who refuses to exploit religion loses an easy tool of control. A leader who insists on truth invites resistance. Traoré's symbolic elevation comes at a cost, but it is precisely this cost that strengthens his position. People recognize sincerity when it demands sacrifice. The twist, then, is not a dramatic reversal. It is a quiet realignment. Ibrahim Traoré emerges not as a ruler who commands belief, but as one who challenges people to live up to it. In doing so, he alters the balance of power, not by force, but by example. As Africa News continues to follow developments in Burkina Faso, this shift may define how Traoré is remembered, not simply as a leader who took control, but as one who redefined what leadership could mean. And that leads inevitably to the final question: what kind of future grows from leadership, rooted not in fear, but in conscience? In a world marked by noise, division, and exhaustion, this story ends not with triumph, but with clarity. A woman still carries her grief. Faith is still tested. The world remains unstable, yet something essential has shifted. From Burkina Faso, a message has traveled farther than borders or headlines. Ibrahim Traoré has not offered salvation, nor has he claimed perfection. What he has done is remind people that dignity does not require permission, and belief does not need to bow to power. In a landscape often reduced by Africa News to conflict and crisis, this reminder matters. Faith, when stripped of fear, becomes courage. Leadership, when stripped of manipulation, becomes service. And hope, when stripped of illusion, becomes resilience. These are not abstract ideals. They are lived daily by people who refuse to let suffering erase their humanity. Traoré's words echo as a final affirmation, not as a threat, not as a demand. We do not ask permission to be free. We stand up to claim it. The question now belongs to the audience. Not which religion is right, nor which nation holds power, but who is willing to live honestly within their faith, and who will remain silent when truth asks to be spoken. If the spirit of Ibrahim Traoré resonates with you, share this story. Subscribe if you believe that truth matters more than headlines and conscience more than control. Do you agree with this conclusion? I will make revisions only after your confirmation.